Good afternoon, all. Welcome to the Research, Reflection and Practices Forum. This is actually our learning forum, and it's a pleasure to have Dr. Nadira Rajapaksa here with us today. And Dr. Rajapaksa is not an unfamiliar figure to us. She has taught on our short course in migration. So we are very happy to have her back at SEPA giving this lecture. So Dr. Nadira Rajapaksa is an assistant professor at the History of Economic Thought Research Department, University of Paris, Panthéon-Sorbonne in France. So let me give a short introduction to her. Nadira teaches history of economic thought, focusing on monetary history, development, migration in economics, and English for economic students. She has a wide research interest. She has researched on migration, history, capitalism, ethics, and economy. Dr. Rajapaksa, to her credit, has many peer-reviewed journal articles, some of which I'm going to cite here for your information. Women, migrant workers, and market forces towards an interdisciplinary representation of female labor migration in research in the history of economic thought and methodology. The lure of Trincomalee in the 17th century, an analysis of the French perspective and its impact on Sri Lanka, maritime identity in maritime Sri Lanka, historical and contemporary perspectives. A journal based in Singapore, World Scientific Publishing Journal. The challenges of teaching English for economics with pluralist theories and fuzzy boundaries, ASP. Reconciling ethnics and economics, Amartya Sen's concept of well-being in well-being, challenging the Anglo-Saxon hegemony, Paris, Presse Sorbonne Nouvelle. Her forthcoming publication is on understanding migration and development through the capability approach in the Journal of Human Development and Capabilities. So while I was researching on Dr. Nadira Rajapaksa, I thought she may be in sociology or in some area like that because of her topic. But I found that she is an economist. And she has done all her academic work in the University of Paris, Panthéon-Sorbonne. She has a PhD in economics, a bachelor's degree in economic epistemology, a master's in money and finance, and a bachelor's degree in money and finance. So she has 2 degrees, and there are few economists here. So her PhD, let me give a little brief line about her PhD. Her PhD was in money and usury during the religious debates of the 13th century. Since then, she has worked on Amartya Sen's approach, reconciling ethics and economics, and she has used this to discuss the representation of migration in economics. So I welcome Dr. Nadira Rajapaksa to talk about bringing culture into development. Just one small note. Let me just briefly introduce this wide topic. Culture is as wide as development. So there are 2 big pillars. She discusses this using Amartya Sen development as freedom framework and aims to highlight the importance of considering culture when defining and implementing development. Dr. Rajapaksa indicates that this requires understanding culture and democracy as constitutive parts of development and using plural identities, especially gender, to interpret culture. There are gender specialists here too. So this talk was on these 2 nuances. So I warmly welcome you once again. Over to you, Dr. Rajapaksa. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Emika. So I will begin. And as she said, I would like to talk today about development and the role culture plays in defining and implementing development. And my purpose here is also to question the mainstream theories that are generally accepted and have widespread consensus. And so questioning accepted theories is also comes from my academic background because, as Indika said, I work with a research department that specializes in the history of economic thought. And here, most of my colleagues and we use history, we interpret the interpretation of texts to question, sometimes positively, sometimes negatively, contemporary economics as well. So the purpose is really to have a broad perspective on even contemporary economics, and we use a multidisciplinary approach. So I have already discussed migration here with SEPA, and today I'm really happy to share this topic on development and culture. And for that, I want to thank Munas and Indika and the team here at SEPA for allowing me to discuss this with you. And the idea is hopefully that at the end of the discussion, you will be able to give me as much input as I can bring for you, because you will see most of my examples are based on India, because I use the Amartya Sen's framework and a lot of other scholars who work on India. So, and then we can open up the question to Sri Lanka. So as I said, FAR is my research department, philosophy, history, and the analysis of economic representation. And these are some of my references. And I also, working on migration, I've worked a lot with sources from SEPA and Chandima's work as well. So today the idea is to talk about development and look at how culture comes into it. Culture has been discussed in development, of course, for a long time. And mainly if we look at the primary source being Weber's work on Protestant ethics, how a certain type of culture is favorable, can be seen as favorable to develop capitalism, as opposed to other types of cultures. And in the references he gives are, for example, Latin America's Catholic culture, or even South Asia's Hindu or Buddhist cultures, which may be seen as not as favorable for trade and capitalist development. So today I will look at how, using Amartya Sen's framework, I will look at how we go from a zero-sum concept to the win-win development concept, and then discuss how development happens by exploring democracy, and that too from a cultural perspective. And finally, bring in the gender dimension as a dimension of culture, as an identity category that is obviously very important when discussing culture. And before I get into my subject, I'd just like to say a few words about Amartya Sen's framework. So his idea of development as freedom is to discuss development as enabling multidimensional well-being. And this is best captured by the capabilities approach. And he defines the capabilities as being anything that a person has reason to value being and or doing. So this can be having income, but no, it's not just about income and utility, it's also about the capacity and the ability to use this income, the ability to go to a shop and buy the goods and services that we need. So this might seem obvious to a lot of us, but Sen recalls the example of caste to explain how low caste people might be barred from going into other shops simply because they are of a caste that is, or outcast, even if they have the money. So this is the idea that Sen brings out with the capabilities, and then he sees development happening as a result of enhancing freedoms. And for freedoms, we need democracy, and that I will go into that in a little while. And the freedoms, I would just like to also point out that this is one of the discussions I've had before, because freedoms are definitely related to migration. And this is some of the things that we have discussed here with SEPA, is how unfreedoms can be present can be presented in a multiple number of ways. For example, women not being able to leave their homes to find work, leaving their homes, let alone leaving the country, or even unfreedoms through exploitative work conditions, or unfreedoms because of outright bans. So this, the idea of freedom in enhancing capabilities and allowing development is a very relevant framework. So to get into the idea of development, looking at the historical, certain historical perspective, and then how we've got to the win-win concept, I'd like to begin with the idea of classical economic theory. So we have our references, Adam Smith, Ricardo, and especially David Ricardo's comparative advantage, which was used as the grounding reference for trade and development. The idea that countries should specialize in whatever they can produce more efficiently compared to others. So this idea of development also foregrounded British rule in India and also much of Western European imperial policies. And it endorsed the zero-sum concept, the idea that, in the case of British rule in India, that British industries had to develop, but at the expense of Indian industries. Shashi Tharoor, in his book Inglorious Empire, brings this out very clearly with the statistics. In 1700, Indian trade, or in the India's share of the world economy, was 27%. And by 1947, it was down to 3%. And this was due to the imperial policies, which were described as the drain, because it was draining India of its capital. It was deindustrializing its economy and led to a lot of other consequences, which we will discuss. This is also well described by David Sunderland in his book, Financing the Raj, where he shows how the trade deficit, so something we're quite familiar, we hear this, we're talking about deficits right now in Sri Lanka as well, global deficits, but also domestic deficits. And here we see how the British trade deficit with the rest of the world was financed thanks to its surplus with its empire. But in order to maintain this triangle, it was important to ensure that the empire remained relatively underdeveloped and continued to import goods, finished goods from Britain, while Britain could then export raw material from the empire. Now, while this was going on, of course, Indians and Indian economists were not silent. In 1892, Mahadev Govind Ranade gave a lecture on Indian political economy, and he set the stage for a number of Indians to take up the discussion. And they sought to promote the idea that industrialization could be beneficial for all. His pioneering lecture allowed the voice of Indian economists to emerge, such as Dadabhai Naoroji, who was well known for his analysis of poverty, but a lot of others, and they were not only economists, there were mathematicians, traders, teachers, also politicians, and this points to a rather progressive economic thinking in a way. And they theorized the idea that India had gone into a period of regress, with some of the most severe famines of its history, with increasing rural indebtedness, poverty, and worsening regional inequalities. So Ranade claimed that Indian economics needed to be based, Indian economics needed to be based on the study of how ethnic, social, justice, ethical, and economic differences in the environments affected social change, and to identify progress and regress in a broader way, and to then identify effective development plans. They highlighted how it was also important to look beyond economic development at a broader definition. This also questioned the idea that progress originated in the West, or the fact or the claim that Britain was ahead of the rest of the world even before the Industrial Revolution. And some of the scholars have given examples of 16th century Emperor Akbar, who was promoting plural religious dialogue, encouraging debate among different cultures, at the same time when the Spanish Inquisition was going on in Europe. So the idea of economic development needed to be compared or set in context in a broader way, and this is what the Indian authors were trying to do. In India, the ground reality was actually deindustrialization, and Dutt's work shows this very clearly. He focuses on the silk trade, explaining how before 1857, when the British were still traders and not rulers, their demand increased India's silk trade by 33%. But afterwards, when imperial economics was set in place, they encouraged the manufacture of raw material, raw production, raw silk, and not manufactured products, so creating deindustrialization. It also led to a lot of inequalities. And these statistics are taken from Tharoor's book, which shows the salaries earned by Indian administrative officials, British and Indians. So in the orange triangle, you have the number of British officials who were earning 13 million pounds, the cylinders, whereas 130,000 Indians, the blue triangles, were earning only about 4 million, 3.5 million pounds. So they were doing the same job. They were civil administrative officials. But before looking at what they proposed, they being the Indian economists, it's also maybe important to look at how economic problems were dealt with before the British era, how crises and inequality were dealt with, or to use economic terms, how economic and social welfare policies were, what was in place, and so on. And here too, we see how cultural practices and customs were, how important this was. Indians were traditionally incited to help each other in ways that did not come naturally to the British, to quote Shashi Tharoor. And this goes back to religious customs. Zakat, one of the main pillars of Islam, or the Sikh practice of free food in the Gurudwaras, their temples, and many others show how redistribution and social assistance were ingrained in local cultures. Also during famines, Indians themselves were more generous and proved to be more effective in helping each other rather than the British, except that this was described by British officials as humanitarian humbug whenever they spoke about native charity. And historians have also pointed out that all this is related to how societies functioned, how rulers were very close to the people, how it was a constant process of negotiation between the rulers and the ruled. Rulers here being in pre-British eras. And these old accessible British rulers were obviously then replaced by British bureaucrats who did not have as much concern for their subjects' welfare as the pre-British era. So looking at all these factors, the Indian economists popularized a rereading of global history, removing the dominant idea that progress originates in Europe and rejecting the dominant theory of comparative advantage. They also theorized the dependent political economy, explaining that India's extreme poverty and worsening economic conditions were not due to any inherent weaknesses, but due to the imperial drain. And finally, they were able to imagine a win-win model of development, whereby all economies could be industrialized at their own paces, taking into account local specificities. Nauroji, for example, stated that if every Indian bought £1 worth of English goods per year, British trade would increase by 250 million. This is in 1887, assuming a population of 250 million. So their idea was to say that an increase in exchange would then boost the capacity to further invest in industrial growth. And in Indian industrialization would also be beneficial to their trading partners. So a win-win, a beneficial system for all. So this idea of development being beneficial, where economies could be industrialized at their own pace, taking into account their cultural specificities, was the message put forward by Indian economists. And since then, of course, development has undergone many conceptual changes and shaped a number of policy measures. And we see this with Sen's work, especially. And then this leads us to the next question, which is how do we bring this about? How do we enable greater freedom? But this then calls for a discussion on democracy, which also requires a cultural perspective. Sen talks about, in an article called Democracy is in Question, he starts by disagreeing with cultural determinism, especially Samuel Huntington's idea that cultural determinism was one of the key factors to explain the different paces of economic development and progress. Sen explains that it is not only culture, but culture is important, of course, but a number of factors needed to be considered alongside culture, such as the different working classes. There was a bigger working class, bigger role of a business class in South Korea, taking Huntington's example, South Korea, than in Ghana. Similarly, South Korea had stronger relations with Japan and the US, which also came into effect and was effective in bringing about economic development. And of course, then education and literacy levels. So from this argument, Sen also points out that democracy is not just about voting, that it is about public reason and discussion. And he sees a big problem in the dichotomy between a democratic West and a non-democratic non-West. And he claims, or he points to a number of examples of a long history of public reason and discussion across the world that has happened in the West and in other parts of the world. He often downplays the Greek claim to be the founders of democracy, also by looking at this definition. That is, if we look only at voting, the practice of voting and elections. But if we look at the broader definition of discussion, participation of plural groups, we see that this goes much wider and further. Mandela himself described, and this again is Sen who quotes the example of Mandela, how he was influenced by seeing meetings taking place in his hometown where a number of groups, people were allowed to speak and everyone was given a chance. There was no hierarchy of speakers. And for him, this was democracy in its purest form. To this, I would like to add another example of Gloria Steinem, taken from a book, the foreword that she wrote in Arab Spring Dreams, which is about the next generation. Speaks out for freedom and justice from North Africa to Iran. So that's the book, and Steinem wrote a foreword in this, which has a very interesting passage about the power of stories. And this again to illustrate the importance of participation and deliberation. For her, telling stories meant sitting in a circle while one person spoke and the others listened. So this led to a natural rhythm of speaking. Some were long stories, some were short, but everyone listened. And for her, in her words, this was the beginning of governance with collective welfare in mind, because this practice was then used also to make decisions. And she claims that this sequence of circles was known to original cultures of Southern Eastern Africa, where humanity originated, and then it spread, of course, through South Asia, Australia, and to the Americas. And this is not related strictly to development, but I do want to share another passage from Steinem, where she talks about language. And one of the questions she asks is, why is it that some or many language groups, and the examples given are some of the Dalit groups in India, the Cherokees of the US, the San of the Kalahari, for example, rarely have gendered pronouns, even though they may have very nuanced words to describe extremely intricate kinship. Whereas in Germanic or Latin languages, even tables and chairs are divided by gender. So she raises the question, why is it that the oldest cultures so rarely create a hierarchy by separating masculine from feminine, mind from body, intellect from emotion, humans from nature? So this is, I find this very relevant, especially right now where we're talking about development seen from a holistic point of view and talking about sustainable development, where nature and the impact on nature, human action on nature comes into, it is one of the main questions. Now, back to Sen and his view of democracy, which is closely tied to identity. One of the key points in his life that influenced him to think about identity was the riots prior to independence in India in 1946 and 1947. And he raises the question, why was it that the broad human beings, so people living side by side, working together in the same neighborhood, became then categorized as Hindus or Muslims of July when the riots began? So why were these plural identities narrowed down to one category, religion in this case? For him, people have plural selves, and this fuels his pluralistic vision of democracy as well. And his argument is to say that we have to draw on the understanding that these forces, the forces that bring about these narrow, rather hostile identity categories, they can be challenged by the power of competing identities, by focusing on plural identities. Now, this identity dimension of culture also has a big role to play in the way economic policies are carried out. And back to our example of India, as I said earlier, in India, the British were mainly interested in making money, not so much in, it was more a career than a crusade. But at the same time, they did change social customs when it suited them to do so. And one of the main examples is 1857 and the mutiny, when they saw Hindu and Muslim soldiers fighting side by side. That this, for them, was seen as a threat. And then they decided that divide and rule was more effective, because then they could pit the two groups against each other, and this would be the most effective way to ensure unchallenged continuation of the empire. And they then, identity categories were also perceived in a very narrow way. The British often misinterpreted and oversimplified the features they saw in Indian society. One of the best examples is caste. Caste in the pre-British era had not been particularly stable nor rigid, but there were variants across time, across place, mainly determined by the dominant groups of the time and their political and economic interests. But with colonialism, castes became rigid and defined and narrowed down to very limited categories. The census exercise was also one of the crucial exercises that helped or, well, led to these narrow identity categories. For example, Brahmins became a sought-after category, whereas the Shudras, who prior, or the outcasts, prior to British rule, were able to move from one princely state to another and therefore start a new life in a way. But with colonialism, they became Shudras for life, wherever they were. And it is quite ironic, because during the caste exercise and collecting information, we could see that the British could actually find no one to tell them authoritatively where or in what number any particular community was. And the Census Commissioners discovered that there was no, the boundary lines between Hindus, Sikhs, or Jains barely existed, and that Hindu and Muslim groups shared a number of common cultural practices relating to food, religion, but the British imposed their assumption that people needed to belong to one particular category, that it was impossible to have overlapping categories, and this then became conventional wisdom. And this is the idea or reading of Indian history that we have today. I also want to share this example of this scholar Dharini, who gives an example of Sri Lanka and shows how hybrid identities was also frowned upon. Again, because the colonial exercise of requiring very clear identity categories for their policies, for their economic measures, this led to hybridity being frowned upon, as it says. And then there's also the historical understanding. Romila Thapa, eminent Indian historian, explains very clearly how, once again, James Mill and his history of British India, which showed India as categorized into 3 periods, according to the religion of the rulers. And so this became the Hindu, Muslim, and British periods. And that the assumption then was that India was always composed of monolithic and mutually hostile religious communities. And she also explains this assumption of Oriental despotism, the idea that economic policies were defined by tyrannical rulers who imposed their views on their subjects. So she says this then, it's the rulers imposing their views on the subjects was the way the British interpreted existing Indian history. So this was seen as Oriental despotism, and that the British presence would then be a civilizing mission against these rulers. And then the idea, the assumption that I mentioned earlier, which is that caste was clearly defined and had that 4 main castes had always existed and being clearly separate in the past. So looking at culture and looking at how identity categories then are used in cultural practices and exercises, we see today one of the questions raised is how is it possible to have democratic practices alongside communal violence, which we see in India and here and in many other countries in the world. And this has been explained by a number of factors, such as the tyranny of majority rule, with relatively low concern for minority interests or plural interests, and also the question of over-centralized governments. And then the whole idea of nation building, where nation states, especially in South Asia, the national identity means almost nothing compared to other public cultures or festivals or religious events, which actually have public endorsement and participation, whereas a national culture is still not clearly identified or not easy to identify. So all this, the possibility of democratic practices with violence points to the need for a definition of democracy, which is not just about elections and voting, but clearly about plural identities and about enabling these plural identities to participate and take an active role in especially decision-making and democratic practices. And then the last point is the example of gender as an identity category and how this, and this is also foremost in a lot of sense discussion, is the example of gender. So how does this come into the discussion on development? Now, we know that South Asia has often been praised for having female figureheads as leaders, and this is obviously commendable, but the question that has been raised is to what extent have these examples actually had an impact on patriarchal structures that still dominate family and social relations? And this is one of the questions that I'd like to raise here. With this in development, looking at development itself, women have been included in the development discourse. We have, as I said earlier, the classical and neoclassical theories, which based development and progress on comparative advantage and productivity, acknowledge disparities. They say, yes, there could be disparities between men and women, but then this is due to productivity. And if we want to address these disparities, we need to increase education. and increase skills. So that was the discourse of the classical and neoclassical theories. Then we have development theories, women in development and women in and development, which focus more specifically on women, have made women more visible in development discourse. And the difference between the two is in women in development, women were still limited to their reproductive roles. Policies were targeted to benefit women, but in their reproductive roles, whereas women and development looked at underlying social structures which created inequalities. So saying that we need to also address other structural inequalities if we want women to benefit from development policies. And then the gender and development theory looks at takes this even further, looking at the roles and relations between men and women. And this is not particularly just focusing on women, but it's focusing on gender and how development benefits one gender over another, and also on the relations between the genders that may impact development, and also have an impact on the way development is effective or not to men and women. So development is indeed a lot about deep and important changes to relations that deal with gender inequality. And then understanding where religion and culture can create maybe foundational arguments that justify these inequalities might be important. Because if we're saying culture, it creates certain inequalities, we need to look at that. Again, this is an article that I took from 2021, which gave the example of the women leaders, but also raised the question of the fact that they were minorities and whether this actually created any change or led to groundbreaking structural changes in society. And if, in order to see where the structural inequalities arise from, we need to look at where religion and culture can create these inequalities. And for that, on religion, I'm just taking two examples, which are quotes from a book called Women in Development and Women in India, edited in the 1980s by Devaki Jain, who was a prominent Indian economist and a female Indian economist. So in this book, some of the examples show how religion has had obviously a strong role to play in the way roles are attributed to men and women, and that this may explain, the power of religion can explain how important or how difficult it is to actually bring about changes. These are some. So the first of Hinduism, or of the texts, and Brahmanism in particular. And the second one, and I'm certainly not an expert or a specialist in this, so I'm sharing this with you so that I can also get your feedback on this, because I do know that even in Buddhism, there was initially a number of restrictions for women that they had to follow, especially showing respect to male monks and so on. But I believe that this changed. So there has been change since then. But the point is that a discourse that is given in of this nature still has a lasting impact, even though we try to change it. So this can explain why it is difficult to bring about structural changes. And then finally, about gender and development is the division of labor. And on this, I would like to just say that division of labor, which comes up in a number of economic theories and economic discourse to explain disparities, is also cultural. And we see this clearly. In Europe, you will never see a woman working in a construction site or a building site, or even doing any manual physical work. But this is very common in South Asia, in India, in Sri Lanka. Women will work carrying loads, they work on construction sites, you can see them carrying stones and so on. So it's not a biological or innate difference that explains the division of labor, but it is again cultural, and it differs from one region of the world to another. And so This brings us then to the end of what I want to share with you almost, is the fact that so culture cannot be ignored. And this is where, I mean, culture comes into development at all points. We were talking about this earlier, the examples of redistribution policies. So the Samurdhi system in Sri Lanka, which is now being replaced, as we were saying, by a new redistribution policy. All these require targeting people, defining and identifying low-income categories, identifying vulnerable groups, and so on. So in these identities and identifications, it is very important to pay attention to the cultural aspect, and not just to narrow economic definitions that might be low-income or not. And to conclude then, I would like to leave you with a quote by Oscar Wilde, which I used also previously in a discussion on migration. It's from The Importance of Being Earnest, and it's about perceived identity. And I used this earlier to talk about the impossibility of being rational. But here, the truth is rarely pure and never simple. I think this is exactly what, it sums up what I'm trying to say in a way. It's that culture is rarely pure, rarely simple. And that when we try to narrow it down, we also narrow down our definition of development and the impact it has on people. And development without culture then is too simple. So we need to question it. I will stop there.
And okay, so thanks once again, and thank you for visiting SEPA again. And thank you very much for coming. If you haven't had your tea, please do go get it. Thanks once again.
Thank you.